Tucker Carlson is throwing out lies. And on his X feed, or whatever you call it, on his show, he's claiming that it was all based on a lie and George Floyd wasn't murdered.
They also sent a cop called Derek Chauvin to prison for more than 40 years. He would be the racist white devil who murdered George Floyd. But the question is, did he actually murder George Floyd? And the answer is, well, no.
Years back, George Floyd was murdered. How do we know this? Well, Derek Chauvin is behind bars for murder, and some of his associates are behind bars as well. We all saw the 9 minutes when Derek Chauvin put his knee on George Floyd's neck. You can't erase that. I guarantee you, if that video did not surface, Derek Chauvin would still be a police officer today. And that's why we had the Black Lives Matter movement. And I say we because I went to a few of those protests. Because like many normal people, they want everybody to be treated as equals in this country, regardless of race, gender, etc. George Floyd was murdered. That's not an opinion. That's a fact according to our court system. Derek Chauvin is a murderer. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, Tucker Carlson is throwing out lies. And on his X feed, or whatever you call it, on his show, he's claiming that it was all based on a lie and George Floyd wasn't murdered. Now, I'm going to get to the actual facts in this case because I have them in front of me. Because I know that a lot of people that are Tucker Carlson fans and Tucker Carlson himself spreads misinformation and conspiracy theories. Here's what Tucker Carlson had to say on his show on social media about George Floyd, and then we'll comment on it.
Did he actually murder George Floyd? And the answer is, well, no, he didn't murder George Floyd. And we're not guessing about that. We know it conclusively, thanks to a new court case now underway in Hennepin County, Minnesota. The case was brought by a prosecutor there called Amy Sweezy. She's suing her boss. So the case is not actually about George Floyd or Derek Chauvin, but it tells you an awful lot about both of them. In her deposition, which you should read, Amy Sweezy describes a conversation that she had with the county medical examiner, Andrew Baker, right after George Floyd died. Quote, I called Dr. Baker early that morning to tell him about the case and to ask him if he would perform the autopsy on Mr. Floyd. Sweezy recalls all this under oath in the deposition. Quote, he called me later in the day on that Tuesday, and he told me that there were no medical findings that showed any injury to the vital structures of Mr. Floyd's neck. There were no medical indications of asphyxia or strangulation. Oh. In other words, George Floyd, according to the official autopsy, was not murdered.
So, let me give you a little bit of background and some facts. The Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office ruled Floyd's death was a homicide. Homicide, in this case, murder, caused by cardiopulmonary arrest complicated by restraint and neck compression, by being subdued by police officers. Tucker Carlson is lying. Now, you have this prosecutor, Amy Sweezy, in a deposition that has absolutely and positively nothing to do with the George Floyd case. I want to start by saying that. Nothing. They're not retrying the George Floyd case all over again. Amy Sweezy made some comments that are being construed by Tucker Carlson and basically calling the medical examiner at Hennepin County a liar. Very simply put, this medical examiner, Andrew Baker, testified under oath that the way the officers held George Floyd down and compressed his neck while restraining him was just more than Mr. Floyd could take given the condition of his heart. Similarly, an independent autopsy said that there was asphyxiation from sustained pressure was the cause. Now, you can make the claim that George Floyd did a lot of drugs, he wasn't in great medical health, he had COVID, he had a weak heart. And those are all fair statements to make. But George Floyd died based on the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office because of Derek Chauvin's behavior. Putting a knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes. And what Tucker Carlson is doing is what he always does. Lies, misinformation, incitement, you name it. We have a prosecutor that said in a deposition that has nothing to do with the George Floyd case, literally, nothing to do with the George Floyd case. She claims, and by the way, this hasn't been substantiated, and Andrew Baker hasn't, claimed that this is exactly what happened. He hasn't come out and said, yep, Sweezy's telling the truth. She claims she had a conversation with Andrew Baker and that Baker found no damage to the neck. Let me be very clear, because also Tucker Carlson is not a doctor, and I'm not a doctor, but even I can tell you, if you're a logical human being, you could still die from Derek Chauvin's actions of the knee on the neck without any substantial damage to the neck, because George Floyd had a weak heart, and we know that the procedures and what Derek Chauvin did, that they were against all company policy. You had a man that was restrained with his hands behind his back, handcuffed. There was no reason for Derek Chauvin to put his knee on his neck for even 10 seconds, let alone 9 minutes. And whether there was fentanyl in his body or not, as I say once again, the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office ruled his death was a homicide based on Derek Chauvin's actions in a court of law. And if you don't believe me, let's go to some other experts, Tucker Carlson not being one of them. Dr. Martin Tobin, a pulmonologist and a care specialist at Loyola University Medical Center. Notice how I'm not quoting eye doctors like Rand Paul, who thinks he's a specialist when it comes to COVID and the vaccines. No, these are actual real experts that testified in the trial. It wasn't just Andrew Baker, the medical examiner, but others as well. This man testified that Floyd died of a lack of oxygen from being pinned to the pavement with the knee to his neck. He added, quote, "A healthy person subjected to what Mr. Floyd was subjected to would have died." That's a pulmonologist. Tobin also noted Floyd's body position. Officers lifting up his handcuffed arms, Chauvin's knee on his neck, back and sides, are what led to his low oxygen levels. Dr. Daniel Eschentmidt, a forensic toxicologist at MMS Labs in Pennsylvania, another expert, unlike Tucker Carlson, testified under oath and presented data showing the levels of methamphetamine found in Floyd's system were lower than the average amount found in 94% of DUI cases in 2020. So for those of you that want to make those claims that he died of drugs, you're wrong, and you have no idea what you are talking about. Then there's cardiologist Jonathan Rich, who also said under oath in a courtroom, "I can state with a high degree of medical certainty that George Floyd did not die from a primary cardiac event. He did not die from a drug overdose." Under oath, the cardiologist Jonathan Rich said that. He also added that had it not been from Chauvin's restraint, he believes Floyd would have lived. Dr. Lindsay Thomas, who was also an expert witness who reviewed documents and videos in the case, echoed Tobin's testimony and noted the slow nature of Floyd's death. You have expert after expert after expert saying, number one, that George Floyd did not die from a drug overdose, and number two, he had a weak heart, and the reason why he died was because of Derek Chauvin's knee on his neck. But because we have a prosecutor named Amy Sweezy in a deposition from a case that has nothing to do with the George Floyd case, who claims that she had a conversation with Andrew Baker and that Baker told her that he didn't see any damage in George Floyd's neck, Tucker Carlson correlates that with, oh, you see, it was all a lie. That wasn't murder. This is exactly like somebody saying the January 6th insurrection was a tourist visit. And by the way, Tucker Carlson has made statements like that. This is the exact same type of misinformation. Tucker Carlson is a liar, and he is trying to do this, in my personal opinion, as another example to downplay or try to make the appearance that racism is not in society and law enforcement can't be racist and Derek Chauvin can't be a murderer, even though he is a convicted murderer according to a court of law, and he is spending time behind bars right now, and including some of his associates, Derek Chauvin is a convicted murderer. This isn't an opinion, but this is what Tucker Carlson does. This is what so many on the far right do. This is what Fox News does. He takes a statement from a prosecutor in a separate deposition that had nothing to do with the George Floyd case, claiming that a conversation with Andrew Baker, the medical examiner, which Baker has not confirmed, so as far as we know, it may not even have happened, where Baker claimed he didn't find any evidence of injuries to the neck on George Floyd, which, by the way, can still mean that he still could have died from that knee to the neck. So Tucker Carlson takes that statement, runs with it, goes on Fox News, salivates on it. Here's an attack to go after somebody black again and defend the white man who's already a convicted murderer. Because that's who Tucker Carlson is. And I have all the evidence here of all the professionals, the medical examiners, cardiologists, PhDs, people who testified under oath in a courtroom that Derek Chauvin killed and murdered George Floyd. Why do some of you people still believe Tucker Carlson, a man with no medical experience? You are entitled to your own opinions in this country, but you are not entitled to your own facts. The earth is not flat. The Holocaust did happen. And Tucker Carlson, who claims that George Floyd was not murdered, is a lie. And it is why Derek Chauvin and some of his associates are behind bars. And it is why Derek Chauvin will never be a police officer again. And it is why Derek Chauvin is a murderer, period. I want to play you a little more audio. A man by the name of Vince Everett Ellison. You may have heard of this guy before. He's an author, and he's made a ton of appearances on Laura Ingram's show, on Sean Hannity's show, and Tucker Carlson's show. He's tried to make a name for himself, and sadly, it has worked by spewing right-wing propaganda and misinformation, in this case, about the George Floyd case. So Tucker Carlson loves these kinds of guests, people that make these appearances on the networks, and people that spread misinformation to fit the Fox News and Tucker Carlson V's narrative, in this case, that George Floyd wasn't murdered. He died of a drug overdose. So listen to this author, who, by the way, has zero medical experience, and we'll kind of do a stop and go here because there's so many times I want to stop this and shout. Have a listen to this. This is Tucker Carlson introducing Vince Everett Ellison, who's just an author and grotesquely spouting out misinformation about the George Floyd murder. Listen to this.
We have to acknowledge the people that gave it to us and why. See, George Floyd is the Democratic Party's prototypical black man. These are the black men they are trying to create. So George Floyd has to be elevated.
Okay, so first of all, the Democrat Party did not create this murder. The person who created this murder was Derek Chauvin and his associates. And the only reason why we know who Derek Chauvin is because of the innocent bystanders, and I would call them heroes, who recorded it. The Democrats did not create this. Derek Chauvin did. If Derek Chauvin doesn't have his knee on George Floyd for 9 minutes, we don't know who George Floyd is. We don't know who Derek Chauvin is. And that has nothing to do with politics. Nothing at all.
Celebrated. He's perfect to them. He was poor. He was uneducated. He was a drug addict. He didn't have a job. He was down there begging and crying and asking the white people to not kill him.
The fact that George Floyd might have been poor, the fact that George Floyd might have been uneducated, the fact that George Floyd didn't have a job is completely irrelevant. But this guy goes on Tucker's show demeaning a man who's dead. It doesn't matter what he did in his past life. Just because somebody's poor or unemployed doesn't give the right for a police officer to murder somebody. So everything that this guy is saying is completely irrelevant to the George Floyd case to begin with. And anybody that is semi-intelligent understands that. But again, this gives somebody the opportunity to go on Fox News and call George Floyd poor or a drug addict or unemployed, which, by the way, has absolutely nothing to do with what took place that day and the knee that was on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes. Nothing to do with it. I'm not going to sit here and say George Floyd's a hero. I'm not going to sit here and look at George Floyd as a martyr, but he is somewhat of a symbol of how some police officers abuse power and in this case commit murder. He's a symbol. Doesn't mean I look up to George Floyd. It doesn't mean that many people look up to George Floyd as some sort of hero. Some people do, and I disagree with them. I don't think George Floyd is a hero. But the fact that he's poor or he was uneducated or that he was unemployed doesn't give a police officer the right to murder somebody, but yet this guy still spews this stuff. And of course, Tucker Carlson doesn't go with any pushback because he loves it. Let's demean the black man, according to Tucker Carlson. Here we go with some more.
To a Democrat, to a white Democrat, this is the perfect black man. So he has to be elevated. Look, not a few days ago, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden celebrated hip-hop music. They had a celebration of hip-hop.
Hip-hop culture is America's culture. It is a genre. It is music and melody and rhyme. And hip-hop is also an ethos.
A music genre that calls the black man the N-word, calls women the W word and the B word, talks about misogyny, shooting police.
Okay, so again, he's talking about things that have nothing to do with the George Floyd case. He's taking a clip from our vice president talking about hip-hop music and about how certain artists use the N-word, and somehow he's trying to correlate that to why George Floyd died. One has nothing to do with the other. Again, him bringing up George Floyd being unemployed, George Floyd being poor, again, completely irrelevant. So that's what people will do, and that's what people will continue to do. What they will do is they will try to chastise George Floyd, forget about the fact that we already have a convicted murderer behind bars and that George Floyd was murdered. But Tucker Carlson will push all that to the side and all the experts that testify under oath, and you'll have this moron author come on the show so he could sell more of his books and spread misinformation.
Smoking dope, selling dope, fighting, killing, acting a fool. They celebrated this genre. Why? Because this is how they see black America. They see us the same way they see George Floyd. And they have to make more of us because everywhere they rule, you know, John F. Kennedy stood in front of the Berlin Wall in the 60s and said, if you think that communism is great, let them come to Berlin. Well, if you think that the Democratic Party is great, let them come to Detroit. Let them come to Chicago. Let them come to St. Louis. Let them come to L.A., Portland, Seattle, Memphis. Anywhere where they rule, you will see George Floyd's all over the place. And they're proud of them. In Baltimore, Maryland, they spend $21,000 per child for every child up there inside the school district. Not one school is proficient in math, science, or reading. But they keep it going every year. Why? Because they're producing George Floyds.
But
and George Floyd's vote for the Democratic Party.
But why would, so when most of us, you, me, I think all normal people look at George Floyd's life, you think this is a disaster. This guy never added anything. He took a lot in prison at least 8 times. I mean, his life was a tragedy at best. Why would you want more people like that?
Because he votes for the Democrat Party.
What an absurd statement.
And then he teaches his children to vote for the Democrat Party. And then these white Democrats can feel superior to him.
What an absurd thing to say by Tucker Carlson. What prominent Democrat out there can you name that has said, we want more George Floyds? Again, Tucker Carlson's lying. I haven't heard, I watch the news every day. Probably 10 hours a day I watch the news. Both sides of the aisle, CNN and Fox News. I haven't heard one Democrat, one elected official, that's a Democrat, that said, we want more people to be just like George Floyd. Tucker Carlson is lying. If you see a statue of George Floyd, or if you see somebody with a sign in regards to George Floyd Lives Matter or anything like that, it wouldn't take a lot of intelligence for people to understand a statue of George Floyd doesn't represent, hey, we want everybody to be like George Floyd. A statue of George Floyd, at least how I interpret it, is George Floyd is a symbol of somebody who happened to be black that was murdered by a police officer. It's a symbol. But somehow Tucker Carlson probably does understand that, but he uses all the dog whistles he can and tries to correlate that with, why are Democrats trying to say everybody should be like George Floyd, when it is to the contrary and nobody is saying that. The fact that George Floyd might have not been the best human being and that he was a criminal, or the fact that he was a drug addict, whatever the case may be, has no bearing on what took place that day. He was handcuffed. His hands were behind his back. And you can't find me one police officer today that would say Derek Chauvin's actions were proper procedure. They weren't. It's why Derek Chauvin is a murderer. But somehow this buffoon named Vince Everett Ellison wants to talk about everything but the facts, everything but what actually matters in this case. He wants to talk about George Floyd being poor. He wants to talk about how George Floyd didn't have a job. He wants to talk about how George Floyd did drugs. He wants to talk about rap music and our vice president. He wants to talk about how rappers use the N-word. And he wants to use all that stuff to try to correlate something that makes absolutely no sense. What is this guy trying to say? What is he trying to say? That George Floyd wasn't murdered? That's what Tucker Carlson is saying. And for those of you on social media now, they're saying that the medical examiner proved that he died of a drug overdose. No, it didn't, and you have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Andrew Baker said the contrary. The medical examiner ruled Floyd's death was a homicide. So you obviously don't know what you're talking about, or you take Tucker Carlson's word for it. Either way, you're wrong. The actual medical examiner in Hennepin County said that George Floyd died of cardiopulmonary arrest complicated by restraint and neck compression, and he echoed that under oath in a courtroom during the trial. You don't know what you're talking about. The medical examiner's office, without the shadow of a doubt, said that George Floyd's murder, and it was a murder, at the hands or the knee of Derek Chauvin. That's simple. And whether George Floyd's heart was weak, or whether, the amount of fentanyl he had in his body, I just gave you the facts of the drugs that were in his body. There was data during the trial that showed the levels of the methamphetamine found in Floyd's system were lower than the average amount found in 94% of DUI cases back in 2020. So there is your evidence right there that George Floyd did not die of a drug overdose and he was murdered. Now, again, I don't have to prove that to you. It's already been proven in a court of law. It's why Derek Chauvin is a convicted murderer. So if you want to listen to Tucker Carlson, or as I like to call him, Tucker the Fifth, the white supremacist sympathizer, because that's who Tucker Carlson is, and he will always be that person. If you want to listen to Tucker, and you want to take his word for it over all the medical examiners that testified under oath, over all the medical professionals that testified under oath, then there's something wrong with you. Either you're not very intelligent, or maybe you're racist, and you refuse to hear the actual facts and the truth in this case. I've been having to deal with this for several years. I had to deal with it with somebody that I had to work with in radio, and I continue to have to deal with it with some people out there that are not very intelligent. And when you bring up George Floyd, the first thing that they want to bring up is not, gosh, it's terrible, he was murdered, I'm glad Derek Chauvin got prosecuted. No. A lot of these people on the extreme far right, the first thing they'll bring up is exactly what Tucker Carlson brings up and exactly what this buffoon author brings up on his show. George Floyd was a criminal. He was on drugs. He shouldn't have broke the law. You'll hear all these things that are completely irrelevant to what took place in that 9 minutes. Let me be very clear, ladies and gentlemen. You could have just shot somebody. And if you're on your stomach and you're not resisting, and if your hands are behind your back and you're handcuffed, an officer cannot use deadly force on you. You are not a threat. You are not going anywhere. And when you are on your stomach and you're not moving and you're not resisting and you're handcuffed, there is no reason for an officer to be using deadly force, period. Doesn't matter what crime you may or may not have committed. George Floyd was on his stomach. His hands were behind his back. He was handcuffed, and that is why Derek Chauvin is a convicted murderer. And if you guys want to continue to listen to Tucker Carlson, and you want to continue to listen to right-wing buffoons out there who have absolutely no idea what they're talking about, then you can go ahead and continue to do that. But it's wrong. And it's frustrating, and it gets me angry. Let me be clear on this. With my opinion on George Floyd in general. George Floyd's not a martyr. He's not a hero. And he probably wasn't a very good person. That doesn't mean that a police officer is judge and jury. And that doesn't mean that a police officer can murder you. What George Floyd did in the past in his life is completely irrelevant to this story. If you see a statue of George Floyd, it doesn't mean that Democrats want everybody to be like George Floyd. Tucker Carlson is lying. And he knows he's lying. If you see a statue of George Floyd, or somebody who talks about George Floyd, it's not because they want people to be just like George Floyd. It's simply they want people to understand that George Floyd is a symbol of a black man who should still be alive today who was murdered at the hands of a police officer.